Hey everyone, Steve here from ProgrammingMadeEasy.com, and today I'm going to be talking to you guys about story points. So story pointing is something that we do in Agile to try to quantify the amount of effort, or sometimes called complexity, of the stories and things that we're being asked to do in our code base, right? Like trying to fix a bug or trying to implement a new feature. Those type of things, we typically are trying to quantify the amount of effort it's going to take in order to deliver on those things. And so we use story points to kind of give some sort of numerical value or impression to the management team about the amount of effort that's going to be required in order to do this thing. So I'm going to transition over here to my slide deck. Now, the name of this talk is called Three-Dimensional Story Pointing, a Rubric for Story Pointing and Refinement. And again, I do want to emphasize that this is going to be about story points and about, Agile, but also I want to give you guys a rubric, some sort of thing that you guys can use to kind of analyze and look at these stories and help decide and determine what some of the challenges are about accomplishing that story and finding ways of using those different, that rubric to find ways of making the stories easier to work with and easier to do. Okay, so that's what the rubric and this talk is going to be about, is, not just figuring out what stories are for or the purpose behind them, but also what is it that you guys can do, a kind of a rubric to evaluate these stories to help determine a direction for the team in resolving some of the challenges. So without further ado, by the way, this is going to be a fairly slide deck heavy talk. I don't really have any code to discuss, but there will be a lot of concrete examples throughout this thing. So there will be some bullet points on things, but just really to visualize the talk as I go along. So if you wanted to just listen to this in your headphones and shut off the video, you certainly could. But I do think that the slide deck is very helpful in illustrating and cementing some of these concepts. All right, so let me just real quickly go through the objectives of this talk. So the first thing is we're going to talk about the purpose of story points and just kind of go over why do we do them, right? Why do we have story points? What is their purpose? Then we're going to talk about that rubric that I was mentioning before. I call it the 3 dimensions of difficulty. You may have heard me use this term before in other videos. You may not. But it is a rubric that we can use and apply to these stories to try to define some of the challenges in fixing or in accomplishing the goal of the story. And then we're going to talk about looking at each one of the different dimensions on that rubric. We're going to look at each one of them and inspect ways of how can we resolve those issues. If there is a challenge on one of those dimensions, what are some of the strategies that the team can do in order to resolve those issues? So we're going to do that, and then we're also going to just kind of do a little wrap-up conclusion here and just kind of go back over what it is that we learned. So first and foremost, let's talk about story points and their purpose, because this is obviously a big piece to this, right? What is the reason why we even have story points? So story points are a reward, right? Story points reward team members for solving problems based on difficulty, not time spent. This keeps team members focused on shipping value, not on spending time. Now, this is a statement that I took directly off of the Atlassian website, so this is what they have to say about it, but I really, really like what they're saying here. And those of you who are not familiar with Atlassian, they are the creators of the very popular ticketing system called Jira. They also write Confluence and Bitbucket. They have a whole suite of different products that are useful for Agile teams trying to do Agile software development. So if you're not familiar with Atlassian, they're a very well-known company within this particular space and helping teams be Agile. And this is what they have to say about story points. I really like this. Again, story points reward team members for solving problems based on difficulty, not on time spent. And this keeps team members focused on shipping value, not on spending time. So you'll see there's this really heavy emphasis on avoiding time, right? Avoidance of time. But there's one thing that I actually really keyed in on in this statement that really kind of clicked for me, and that was the use of the word difficulty, right? On that top line, the very last word is difficulty. If you've ever worked in an Agile environment and you've tried to do story pointing before, chances are the word complexity came up, right? How complex is this story? But I think difficulty is a much better word for this. And I understand that those two terms are pretty synonymous. But to me, I think difficulty is a bit more of a broad term, whereas complexity has a little bit more focus on the challenge itself, right? How complex is the problem? Whereas difficulty, I think, is a bit broader of a term that expands out to external forces, external things from the complexity of the story in and of itself, right? So we can kind of turn outwards, away from the code or away from the challenge of the question or the work that's being done, and actually notice that, hey, there's other pieces to this effort that need to be factored in order to determine what the level of effort is in order to deliver on this story. And so I really like that term difficulty. I use it much more than I use complexity. And you'll actually see that I still do use complex, but I use it in a completely different way that I think will probably solidify your guys' knowledge and understanding. And that has a lot to do with the rubric. So aside from the fact that there's difficulty, I want to focus here on their kind of avoidance or really expressed way of saying, look, guys, story points are not about time. They're not about time. They're about shipping some sort of value to the customer. That's what story points are supposed to represent, is the difficulty of the problems that are being shipped to the client. Okay, that is what the point of story points are. And when it comes to the association of story points to time, this is typically done, I think, because management has this really heavy emphasis on meeting deadlines, right? When can we deliver on this? When can we ship this thing? When will we know this particular feature is ready to go? And that kind of thinking is really a reflection of this command and control kind of waterfallish system where we plan ahead of time and have some sort of due date at the end. Whereas Agile and extreme programming really focus more on continuous delivery, right? We're continuously providing iterative change. We consistently provide new things and implementations that provide some sort of value to the customer. And it's not about providing this one block of code and delivering on this set date, but rather making incremental changes that are better and better for the user and providing more and more value, kind of a growth of the product rather than a delivery of the product, right? It's about growing the system to make it more valuable to the customer. And it's a very different mindset that is difficult to, it's difficult for management teams to understand and comprehend and put some sort of wrapper on so that they can compartmentalize it and explain it to their higher ups, right? Or to the customer about delivery and what's going to be received. So this is kind of where that struggle starts, right? Of what it is that the team is doing and the value of the work that they are doing compared to this delivery date mechanism that a lot of management's looking for. So what I really kind of want to point out here is if you're using story points to try to quantify time, what you're doing is you are not effectively using story points for their correct purpose. You're muddying the waters of what a story point means. Because if your management is asking the development team to attribute some sort of story points to a story, but that actually is a representation of time, then you're not really focusing on the difficulty. You're not really focusing on the amount of effort to solve this thing. And just to give you kind of an example here, let's say you have two different developers that are going to focus on exactly the same problem. Does that mean that the problem is any more difficult for one person or the other? No, it's the same level of difficulty for both people, but one person might have the skill set to, or might stumble upon the answer or solution a little faster than somebody else. But that doesn't change the difficulty or the amount of effort required in order to do it. It just means somebody came across the solution faster or slower than somebody else might. And the very fact that it can take two individuals different amounts of time to come up with a solution to the exact same problem means trying to associate this with time is a foolish notion, right? We cannot do that. We don't know. We can maybe estimate like this person, and this person, each individually might take different intervals of time. But guess what? If you put all three of them together in the room working on the same problem at the same time, they might take even less time. They may take more time, right? So trying to associate solving a problem with time is just a foolish notion to begin with. It really needs to be done away with altogether. It's hard to do, though, I understand, because most of us are under some sort of management pressure to set a deadline and deliver by some sort of delivery date. And just know, story points, there are other ways of trying to manage that and figure that out, but using story points for that mechanism, I think, is a very foolish notion. And that's really, we've had decades and decades of people trying to do it that way, and for decades we've had no actual solution. I really highly recommend, there's a book, if you're interested at all, there is a book, it's called Mythical Man Month. Let me switch back over to this view here so you guys can see this. This is a really good book. I recommend everybody to read. It's by Frederick Brooks. It's called The Mythical Man Month. Yeah, I just so happen to have it here on my desk. It's that important to me that you guys read this book. It's really, really good. It talks about that mythical idea of a man month, knowing how much time it's going to take for a development team to produce some bit of code. It's just foolhardy. It doesn't actually exist, no matter how much management wants it to happen. Okay, so anyway, I've been talking a lot about that, and I can't really emphasize that point enough. Again, story points are not about time, and if you start to try to associate them with time, it really starts to force the developer to think about things in the wrong terminology and kind of juggle these separate balls in the air at the same time about, is the story difficult or is it going to take more time? And which one of those am I actually pointing off of? It makes it really hard. So some additional points that I want to make about story pointing. Stories should be pointed according to complexity, unknowns, and communication, but not time. Okay, so we have these three different dimensions here that I mentioned, right? Complexity, unknowns, and communication. So we talked a little bit about complexity before. Complexity is kind of the solution, right? How difficult will the solution actually be? That has more to do with the code that needs to be implemented or the reasoning about the code that needs to be implemented. That's kind of the complexity quotient of this, right? Then there's the unknowns. And when we're talking about unknowns, we're thinking about things like, what if there's an API that I've never encountered before? I need to go read the documentation. Or maybe there's a new framework that I need to implement and I need to go work with it a little bit. Or again, with an API, maybe I have to test out creating some sort of client to go talk to the API so that I can see how to work that kind of thing, because I've never worked with the clients and APIs before. So if there's an unknown to the developer, that adds to the level of difficulty to accomplish that particular thing, right? And it has nothing to do with the complexity of the solution, but it does have everything to do with the difficulty to deliver that thing. So just kind of going back to that difference that I make, that distinction that I make between complexity and difficulty. Complexity is more about the scope of the code and the reasoning that you have to do about the code that needs to be written, whereas unknowns is a completely different dimension of difficulty that is about exploring things, about finding out and discovering what are those components that you don't yet know about. And you have to go solve those problems before you can even start writing the code. And then the third dimension here that I mentioned is communication, right? And this is about third-party communication, talking to somebody outside of your team, typically, talking to a customer and trying to get better requirements from them, better stories written from them, understanding more about the problem from them. Maybe you have to talk to an external team. Maybe you're working on the front end, but you have to work with somebody on the back end in order to get them to implement something, and you have to convey that information to them. Maybe there's a DBA that you've got to go talk to set up some database tables, right? That has nothing to do with the complexity of the problem. That has everything to do with someone else that you have to communicate with in order to accomplish the goals of this story. And that needs to be factored into the difficulty, the amount of effort required in order to accomplish this story. It's not just a straightforward answer of this is a complex problem and I have to write this code to do it. There are other factors involved here, like the unknowns, the things that need to be explored and understood. And then there's the communication aspect if you have to talk to somebody outside of your direct team, right? You have to talk to another team in the organization, another customer, or maybe it's an API that you're communicating with and you've got to go talk to the creators of that API, right? If there's some sort of external communication involved there, that adds to the level of difficulty, and that is a different dimension of difficulty. Okay, so story points are a tool for determining if stories are small enough, and that's one of the things. Stories should be small enough to do, right? And you can use story points to decide whether or not a story is accomplishable because it's too big or if it's small enough. So you can look at the amount of story points that you've attributed to it and decide, you know what, this story is not ready for us to work on it. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. One of the other things that I like to point out with teams all the time is that the only actual known time quantity, and I'm going to go back to this argument about time, the only known time quantity thing that you and your team actually know for certain regarding time is how long your current iteration is. How long is this current iteration? And that's not future iterations. That's not, hey, we have 3-week iterations or 2-week iterations or 1-week iterations. Like that can change, right? You can go from a 1-week iteration this week, and then at the end of this week, your product owner or project manager may come to you and say, hey, we're going to change this up. We're going to make everybody go to a 3-week iteration now. And so the only thing that's really 100% certain is that your current iteration ends on this day, right? Like that's the only thing time-wise that you truly know about. You don't know how long stories are really going to take. You don't know how long it's going to take to explore those unknowns. You don't know when Charlie's going to get back from his vacation to respond to your email you sent. You don't know how long it's going to take for that story that you passed along to the DBAs to complete so that you have the tables to work with. Like none of those things are truly definitively known, even if they give you promises. Oh yes, I will have this done by Thursday. You can count on it. Well, Thursday rolls around quite often and it's still not done, right? Or you think about Thursday and it gets delivered at the end of day on Thursday, so you missed all of that Thursday. There's really no set time quantity that you can be absolutely certain of other than really the iteration that you're currently undergoing, right? Any future iterations could change, and the stories themselves, we don't really know how long it's going to take. Okay, and then the last point that I kind of want to make about on this slide here is there's really no such thing as a 0-point story. Okay, and I say except for spikes, and I'll talk about spikes. They're kind of an interesting little caveat that really relates to something else that I want to talk about later on. But there's really no such thing as a 0-point story. And if you think about this, I think most of us inherently already recognize this, especially when you start thinking about story points are about effort and difficulty and things like that. That would theoretically mean you could have 1,000 stories in your backlog, each of them is 0-pointed, and it should take you, there's no level of effort involved in doing them. And if that's the case, if you have a quote unquote 0-point story, my question would be, why is it your responsibility to do it? If you guys are the software developers, you guys are the experts with these certain sets of skills to resolve these difficult problems and put forth some sort of skilled effort to resolve. If this is truly a 0-point story that requires no effort and is not difficult, it really shouldn't be something you guys are trying to tackle. Somebody else can do it, right? Somebody else, whoever gave you that story should theoretically be able to do it because it's 0 points. There's no effort, there's no difficulty, there's no challenge here for us to do it. If that's the case, then why are you doing it? Why is it your responsibility as a software developer to tackle things that have 0 points? And again, I think this also relates a little bit to the statement that Atlassian puts up there, about delivering or shipping value. If you're saying that a story has no value, then again, why are you doing it? Like if there's 0 difficulty, there's 0 challenge, there's 0 value to this, why are you doing it? Why isn't it someone else's job to handle these kind of menial, if you will, tasks that don't really have anything to do with your job or the complexity of problems that you're trying to solve? You guys are the experts being paid very well to solve problems. And if you're receiving 0-point stories, it seems like a pretty wasted effort. It seems like it's not really worth, the resources that are being applied to solve that problem. And I realize I don't really like the word resources in terms of people. I don't think that that's a very humanizing term. But I just want you to understand, this is a very poor allocation of your time if they're trying to tell you to tackle 0-point stories, because that just wouldn't make sense. Instead, you should have some sort of baseline value, minimal value that's associated with a story. Okay, and I'm going to make a caveat here for spikes. We'll talk about spikes. They're a very special category that I definitely want to tackle. But when it comes to an actual user story, they should have some sort of point system, right? It should be some sort of value that or difficulty and effort that needs to be required to resolve them. Okay, so let's talk about a user story. What would a good user story look like? This is something that I think we need to fundamentally start with is, what should a story look like so that we know what it is that we're pointing? And I like to break down stories into 3 questions. There's who, there's what, and there's why. So the who of a user story is typically written in this kind of format. Like, who would be the as. So as Thomas, as Joe, as Joan, as Kamala, as whoever, right? As this person, right? That is who this is for. That is who this effort is going to be for. Then we say the what, right? So what is it that this person wants to be able to do in the system? And so we write that out in our user story as the I want to phase. So we're kind of putting together here a template, right? As so-and-so, I want to do this thing. And then you finally have the why. So we have who, the what, and the why. And the why can be expressed as so that I can do this, I can do that, right? Whatever the value is for that particular user. So this is a very well-defined, this is a very common template you'll probably see in a lot of places if you're looking for how to write user stories. This is a very common template. As so-and-so, I want to do X, Y, Z in the system so that I can do this, right? So a pretty common example, and I just want to kind of talk real quick here before I get into the example. How is not a part of this, right? How this is accomplished, how it is that this particular piece of software is written is not a part of the story. Okay, we don't do that. We do not include how this is supposed to behave, right? Or how you write the code, or the technical specifications of the code, or some sort of technical detail is not expressed in this story. It's strictly about who, the what, and the why. Now, a good example of this would be a story like this. As Thomas, okay, and Thomas would be a persona. I want to be redirected to the account page after submitting valid credentials so that I can view my account information. So we're using that template. As so-and-so, I want to do this so that I something, right? As Thomas, I want to be redirected to the account page after submitting valid credentials so that I can view my account information. This, again, I want to point out, I can't stress this enough because this is a mistake I see a lot of development teams have in their story writing. There is no mention whatsoever about how, right? There is one little thing in here about the fact that we have an account page, but what that route is not in here, right? What is the route? I don't know. It doesn't really matter. It might be something you want to mention, but it's not a technical specification. It's not really that much of a requirement for the user to understand this. And so that I can view my account information. Again, that has really nothing to do with the software developers. We're not looking at implementation details. We are instead looking at, from the user perspective, who is it, what are they trying to do, and why do they want to do it? That's really, really important to do. So that big common mistake of trying to figure out some sort of technical implementation detail that gets shoved in here, I see a lot of teams doing that. Another thing that I see a lot of teams do is they replace this persona of Thomas with developer. So they might say something like, as a developer, I want to implement unit testing across the board so that I can be confident in my code, right? Like that's just taking a technical specification and jamming it into this format. And that's not what the purpose of stories are for. They are not for the developer. They are for an outside person. They are for some sort of third-party customer, some sort of user that is going to be interacting with your application, right? Whatever that application boundary is that you work with, they are interacting with your boundary, with your system. And the stories need to be presented in that way. And there's a very key reason why we do this. User stories are not about the developer. They're not for the developer to understand the technical specifications and requirements. And that's the most common thing that they're misappropriated for. Stories are about communication between the client and the developer. And that means they need to be understandable by both parties. If you are writing something that is a technical specification in the user story, only one party of that that's reading that story will understand it, right? If it's a technical specification, then the user will not be able to understand why, right? They won't understand the purpose or reason. So just be very, very careful there. You do not want to say how something is supposed to be done, nor do you want to make a story about the developer or the team. It is about that user, about the consumer of the product, okay? All right, so knowing this format of the user story, let's jump into the rubric that I promised you guys about. So the rubric looks something like this. We start out, remember I said there's no such thing as a 0-point story, right? There really shouldn't be. There should be some sort of level baseline effort value. In this particular case, just for demonstration purposes, I'm giving an initial story point value of 2. And I like this. It's a nice little rubric to use. If you guys don't want to use multipliers here, I understand that. If you prefer the Fibonacci scale, you can certainly do that. Just know that each one of these dimensions is going to increase or jump up a level on the Fibonacci scale. But I do like this multiplier. It just makes things a little simpler in terms of understanding. So we start out with some sort of initial story point, and then for each one of these dimensions, remember I mentioned what the dimensions were earlier: complexity, unknowns, and communication. So each one of them adds to the story point. It actually is a multiplier for the story point in this case. But again, if you're using Fibonacci scale, it just means go up a level, right? Whatever. So if you're using Fibonacci scale, maybe your initial story points is 1. And then if there's complexity, so if any one of these dimensions is true, then you would increment. So you'd go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 5 to 8 to 13, etc. But I think the multiplier, for me, it just works a little bit better. So we have this rubric here that says, okay, if there's complexity, we're going to have a multiplier of 2. If there's a set of unknowns, then that's a multiplier of 2. If there's communication things that I have to talk to some other team or somebody outside of our team, then that's going to also add to the difficulty. It's another dimension of difficulty to this story. So this works out like this. So if we have a story that has no complexity, no unknowns, no communication problems, then we just have the initial story pointing of 2. So just one thing I do want to point out here about each one of these, about this rubric, is that complexity, unknowns, and communication, in my mind, should remain a yes or no, true or false Boolean. When I've worked with teams in the past on this, there has been a question about, can we try to put some sort of quantitative value on complexity? Like, complexity could be 0 to 5 scale, or complexity could be, on the Fibonacci scale, and we try to evaluate that. I really shy away from that because I think it gets away from the certainty that this rubric really helps to provide and kind of distorts the meaning and purpose. I don't like the idea of kind of trying to, in a different dimension, try to quantify these different dimensions of difficulty. But that being said, if your team really thinks that it would be valuable to kind of also expand out on the complexity, unknowns, and communication issue and create some sort of value other than true or false on it, I certainly understand that. But for me, and the way that I present this and the way that I think about it, I think it's much better for us to just strictly stick to, is it complex or is it not? Are there unknowns or are there not? Is there some level of communication with a third party that's required or not? And being that definitive about it, I think really helps to solidify and make clear what the intent of this rubric is, as well as provide some direction for you that I'm going to be talking about a little bit later. Okay, so going back to, we have an initial points. If we start out with initial points, all stories begin at 2, but there are no, for this particular story, there's nothing complex. There aren't any unknowns that need to be explored, and there's no external communication that's required. Then that means that this story can remain a 2. Now, if we say, yes, it's true that there is some level of complexity to this. Okay, so there's something about this story that is complicated and needs to be resolved, or it's a complex problem, it's a complex solution that we need to implement, then that means that it is now 4, because we just use the multiplier of 2. Now let's say that there are 2 of these dimensions that are true. So maybe it's not a complex problem. Maybe the solution or the ask is not really all that complex, and we know that there's not going to be a ton of code. But I don't know about that API that we're going to be talking about. Maybe it's a brand new API that we're implementing. And maybe there's some level of communication that needs to go on between us and some other team, or I need to talk or discuss this a little bit further with the customer in order to get some clarity on this and what they're looking for. So if there's 2 or more of these dimensions that are true, then we really shouldn't be trying to take on this story. It's acceptable to have 1 dimension of difficulty. Okay, that's going to be actually quite common to have at least 1 dimension of difficulty. But once there are 2 or more of these dimensions, you really should be thinking about not doing the story and finding ways to resolve those dimensions of difficulty. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about that here in the upcoming slides about how you resolve each one of these. But just know that if you start getting to a point, where 2 or more of those dimensions are going to be challenges, then you probably shouldn't be doing that story until you resolve those challenges. So again, if all 3 of these different dimensions of difficulty exist, you really, really should not be doing them. And I will say that if you find that you have a lot of time, you don't have all that many stories, you only have the one that you're trying to tackle, or a handful that you're trying to tackle, but some of them have 2 dimensions of difficulty, but not all 3, I can kind of see where you might accept a story that's got 2 or more dimensions, but I really would recommend that you still hold off on doing them. And again, we'll talk about how to resolve each one of these dimensions and the challenges presented by them coming up here. But just know that I really think it's a good idea to only allow your team and yourselves 1 dimension of difficulty on a story to be resolved, and that's just it. Okay, so moving on to complexity. So how do let's say that we have a story that has 2 or more dimensions of difficulty that have been identified for the story. And in order to make it so that that story only has 1 remaining dimension of difficulty, and when we want to get rid of one of those dimensions, right? We want to resolve one of those problems. How do we resolve the problem of complexity? How do we eliminate the complexity of the story? You can't always do it. You can't always eliminate all of the complexity of a story, but there are some things that you can do to definitely eliminate a lot of it. So the first thing that you need to recognize is that complexity is not strictly an architectural problem. Architecture can be a part of the problem of complexity, but really what we're talking about when we're talking about complexity is the scope of the problem, right? So it's not about the infrastructure, it's not about the architecture, but it's about the size of the problem itself, right? What are maybe all the different pieces of architecture that I need to go talk to? That's certainly a thing, right? If I have, I really like the rule of 3 for a lot of things. I'm kind of obsessed about the rule of 3, that if I have to talk to 3, or I have to write code or talk to 3 different layers of architecture, then that automatically means it's a complex problem. But that doesn't necessarily always hold true. It's just kind of a good general rule of thumb for me. You guys are welcome to take that. But typically, If you're talking to a lot of pieces of architecture in order to accomplish the goal, then yes, it probably is what is the driving reason why it is a complex problem you're trying to solve. However, scope, and thinking about it in terms of scope, goes beyond that idea of just the architecture, right? You could be writing a single component in React, for example, that doesn't touch any other layers of architecture, and it can still be a very complex problem, right? Maybe everything is handled within that one component, but there's a lot of little logic trees that are involved in trying to decide what to do for certain displays on the screen that have absolutely nothing to do with communicating to other pieces of architecture. And that's the thing. Scope is not just about the different layers of architecture. It can be, right? Architecture can be part of it in all the different pieces that you need to reach out to and bring together to solve that problem. But really, it's about the size of the problem. Understanding how big of the ask is this? How big is the solution that needs to be implemented to resolve this thing? And that may or may not touch on architecture. So complexity, saying that a story is complex, really is an indication that the scope is too large, right? It's too big and it needs to be broken down into smaller stories. So this one big story needs to be broken down into smaller stories. That's what complexity really, at its heart, truly means. And there are ways that we can look for seams within those stories, that one big giant story. There are typically some areas within that story that we can find to break that story open into other stories, right? One or more other stories that are really a part of this story that we originally wrote. So those edges can be the steps in the use case workflow, and we'll talk about the use case workflow in just a moment and look at those steps. But you can identify some of those seams based upon the steps that you expect the user to take going through the program. You can also, if you have a story and you're trying to write what's called acceptance criteria, we'll talk again about acceptance criteria here in just a moment. But if you end up writing a bunch of acceptance criteria for that one story, that typically means that those different acceptance criteria could actually be rewritten as new stories. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then also, if you are writing an acceptance criteria that has a lot of the words and, or if in them, typically that means that the acceptance criteria should be broken out into other acceptance criteria and thusly could also be broken out into other user stories. So if you find yourself writing acceptance criteria with a lot of ands, ors, or ifs, then that means that you're probably trying to encompass too much. You're trying to add too much to this one acceptance criteria instead of thinking about breaking it apart into smaller pieces. So thus, 3 different seams. We're going to identify and look at each one of these here individually now. So the first one was about use cases, right? And looking at, and just to go back here, we're looking for edges in a story. We're looking for edges somewhere along this understanding and comprehension of the work being asked of us. And one of those ways that we can look for places to split off a story into other stories is by looking at the steps that are articulated in a use case. So, and these are use case workflows. They look something like this. They're just kind of a idea of what the user will be doing. Like, what are the specific steps and things along the way that a user is going to do or encounter as they go through the system to do something, right? So in this case, a very simple and common example is, the user wants to log in, right? They want to log into the system. So what are they going to do? How are they going to interact with the system? Well, the first thing is they're going to navigate to the home page, right? They're just going to, the main page, they're just going to navigate to it. Then they're going to click on some sort of button or link or something that's going to take them to the login page, where they will then enter in their credentials. Once they've entered in their credentials, they'll click on the submit button. And when they click on the submit button, if everything is okay, then they will be redirected to their account page. So that would be their login use case. If I want to log in as a user and be redirected to my account, these are the sequence of steps that I will have to go through in order for me to accomplish that goal. Well, if we look at this, there's one particular step along the way that this whole decision tree can really break apart and be broken into other areas. And that's this clicking of the submit button. Because we kind of took this perspective initially when thinking about this use case and only took the happy path. But what if at the point where the user clicks on the submit button, there's the sad path? What if they've entered in bad credentials? What if they've attempted too many times, right? Then what do we do? So it's not always about being automatically redirected to the account page. There are other ways that we can kind of fork off from this clicking of the submit button. So the workflow might look something like this instead. So again, the user navigates to /, they click on the login button, they enter in their credentials, and when they click on the submit button, if everything is fine, they will be redirected to the account page, right? We've already established that part of the workflow. But there's also the possibility that the credentials that they've entered are bad, right? It's the wrong username, it's the wrong password, etc. And so if that's the case, then they should be redirected back to the login screen so they can try to attempt another login attempt, right? And they should probably also receive some sort of error message that tells them what went wrong. And you may not want to be explicit about this. You may not want to say your password wasn't the right password or something like that, because hackers can sometimes use that information to brute force their way through things. But you do kind of want to think about presenting some sort of error message on that login page if the user gets redirected, so that there's some sort of indication about why the user is back on this page. Otherwise, they might think, oh, my login worked, but why am I back at the login screen? So you need to present some error message. But let's talk about too many attempts, right? What if you have a maximum number of 5 attempts per 30 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever, and so they've reached that maximum, and so they need to be redirected to a completely different page. It may be back to the login page with a different error message, but in this case, just to kind of make things simple, maybe I put some sort of page together that says, that's called /failed. And if they've attempted too many times, they get redirected to that page instead. So they're not allowed, they don't get presented to log back in again because they really shouldn't even be trying at this stage. So that may be the strategy you take. Now, I want you to think about stories and look at each one of these steps. And what a user story is a way of articulating one or more of these steps, right? A user story is a way of articulating one or more of these steps. And typically, if a story is too large, it is trying to have more than one step being articulated, right? So maybe we try to create a user story that is the login user story, right? As Thomas, when I want to log into the system so that I can look at my account information, right? That is a story that tries to encompass way more steps, right? Writing that story, as Thomas, I want to log into the system so that I can look at my account information. That encompasses all of the steps that we see on this page. And that is way too much. We're trying to do too much within that one story. But if we break out the steps individually like this, and all of the different branches and decision trees that can happen from each of the different pieces of this, we'll see that each one of these blocks is actually in and of itself a user story. It is, so each one of these steps, that clicking on the submit button to get to that point is a user story. Once they click on the submit button, being redirected to the account, if everything is good, that's a different user story. Clicking on the submit button and entering bad credentials is a different user story. Clicking, especially when we're talking about being redirected to the login versus the error message, right? Those are actually two completely different stories potentially, where if the user enters in a bad username and password, one story could be about being redirected to the login, but another story could be about the error message that's created and displayed. So you actually have potential here for every one of these steps along the workflow for a completely new user story. Okay, and that's how you can identify areas where maybe you're just trying to write a user story that is encompassing too many of these steps. There's too much that you're trying to catalog in this story in terms of all of the steps that kind of fall under that category of that user story. And instead, we should be looking individual steps that the user's taking along the way, and each one of those steps could potentially be its own story. Now, that doesn't mean that I think you need to have a one-for-one. It doesn't mean that every single step along a workflow requires its own story, but just know that if you are encountering a story that is too big, you should be looking at ways of breaking it apart by looking at the steps involved in order to accomplish it. And that's where you can find the seams within the story to write out some other stories. Okay, hopefully that is clear. So we have this new set of sad paths that could potentially be gone through or written up as new stories. And that's what we're looking for, right? Where this breakdown of the happy path and then sad paths themselves can be completely different stories. And that helps us kind of break apart that initial story. Now, one other thing that I do kind of want to point out about this before I move on, I want you to think back to what that original story was. And notice how much easier and thinner it is now. How much, we call it vertically slicing stories. The original story of, I want to log into the system, right? I want to, as Thomas, I want to log into the, log into the system, log into the system so that I can look at my account information. That story, if you have different stories that deal with the sad paths, right? You have other stories that deal with all the things that could go wrong in that process, then this one story that we originally wrote becomes much easier to handle because it's only handling the happy path. It's only handling the correct credentials have been submitted, and now we need to redirect them to the account. So that one workflow, that one sequence of steps is much easier to tackle as a story than trying to tackle the entire thing as one story. Okay? All right. So what are some of the other seams that we can find aside from just, looking at the workflow and all the different steps, especially if you've been handed a user story and you did not work with a customer to break down those steps. And so maybe your product owner or project manager or somebody else is handing you stories and you need to look at them and say, well, we need to figure out some ways of coming up with other stories, but we're not going to go through this workflow process, or I don't have time to go through the workflow process. What are some of the other things you can look for? Well, we're going to go back to, once again, here's the initial set of use case steps, right? Login use case, they navigate to the home page, click on a login button, they enter in their credentials, they click on the submit button, and they should be redirected to the account page. But if there's bad credentials, what do you do? And if there are too many attempts, what do you do? So that's the initial setup here. What are some of the things that we as developers would do when looking at this story and this sequence of events, the sequence of steps that the user wants to take? When we're looking at the one action of clicking the submit button, we might write out some acceptance criteria that would look like this. So given I submit valid credentials, when I click the submit button, then I should be redirected to the account page. So this is what we call the acceptance criteria. You'll notice that the format that I've written this in is something called Gherkin. So if you've never heard of Gherkin, this is the language. It's given, when, then. And I really like to think about given, when, then as a replacement for arrange, act, assert. So if you've ever done test writing before, if you've ever written tests in programming, you've probably heard of arrange, act, assert. It's one of the first things that you learn when you're writing tests is this kind of how do you format a test. You set up the state of the system initially, that's the act. Then that's the arrangement. You kind of set up all the circumstances, the state of the system. That's your arrange part. Your act is the actual thing, the trigger, the event that occurs that you're trying to test. And then the assertion is the resulting behavior or new state of the system. That's kind of the sequence that you go through. Set up this initial state of the system, do some sort of thing, and then make sure that the result of doing that thing is this thing, right? This new state or this particular behavior. And if you think about it in terms like that, given, when, then is the exact same thing, just different language, right? Given and arrange are the same thing. So given this set of circumstances. So arrange would be arrange these set of circumstances. The when in given when then, the when I click the submit button is the act of arrange, act, assert, right? So when this thing happens, or pretend or act this way, or act or do this thing, right? That's the when. So arrange, act, and then finally assert is then. So then and assert are synonymous. So then I should be redirected to the account page. So the assertion should be that, the assertion in a test would be that some sort of trigger to be redirected to account page would be the result of that action. So given when then is really the same thing as arrange, act, assert. It's just that you're using a different vocabulary, a different language, because this is easier for a user or a customer to read, right? If you tried to present a user with arrange, act, assert, and you gave that to the customer, they wouldn't know what you're talking about. But if you said, given when then, given I submit valid credentials, when I click the submit button, then I should be redirected to the account page, that is something that the user could actually read and understand, right? And that's one of the great things about using the Rubric language in order to frame these kind of acceptance criteria, is that it's something that the user could actually understand. That's why we do it this way. So not only that, but when we're talking about the acceptance criteria here, I do want to point out that acceptance criteria is not user stories, right? So given when then is not a user story in and of itself. It could be translated to a user story, but it is not in and of itself the user story. Okay, that's one thing I just really want to make clear here, is that given when then is the acceptance criteria. It is not a user story. Now, the purpose of this acceptance criteria is much like the purpose of a test. And that's why I really like to make this comparison, or this, really, they are synonymous. They are the same thing. And in frameworks like Cucumber or SpecFlow, this given when then actually is the test. So I'm not making this up. It's not like just some comparison that I drew out of my, what. It actually is supposed to be a test. And it is the definition of done, essentially. It is when we can pass this given when then test, then that means this particular step or this particular story is done. It is ready to go. It is ready to be shipped. So this acceptance criteria is very important because it really helps narrow the focus and define what it is exactly that the behavior of the system should be. And this is where we start to jump onto the how. So remember how when I was talking about user stories, we were avoiding the how. We were talking about the who, the what, and the why, but we weren't talking about how. Here, we're starting to kind of get a little bit closer to the how. We're starting to get a little bit closer to defining the how of the system and how it should be working exactly. These are closer to specifications than the user stories. Okay, but they're still written in a way that, again, a user, a customer could read them and probably would know exactly what you're talking about. Maybe they don't know exactly the reason or intent or purpose behind the / account page, but they can probably get a pretty good idea of that. Okay, so that's enough about acceptance criteria. What I kind of want to talk about now is, okay, looking again at this click submit button and knowing that we have this given I submit valid credentials when I click the submit button, then I should be redirected to the account page. That is the happy path acceptance criteria, right? That's one of the pieces that we put in. We might write some more about the happy path, but that's just one of the happy path acceptance criteria that you would write. But when we start to examine the sad path, what about if they have bad credentials? What if they have too many attempts? Well, then you might write an acceptance criteria that looks like this. Given I submit a bad username, when I click the submit button, then I should be redirected to the login page. And that should probably sound a little familiar, right? We kind of came up with that when we were talking about the workflow and the different steps that the user would take. This is just a different area where we've identified that branching. We've found it, instead of looking at the workflow and looking at the steps, we've instead been able to identify it while we were thinking about the acceptance criteria around clicking on that submit button. So it's just a different area to find the exact same thing. That's all that this is. It's the same. We're still trying to do the same thing. We're trying to find the different branches of logic here, but we're using a different mechanism to identify it. And in this case, it's the acceptance criteria. So we would write this acceptance criteria that again says, given I submit a bad username, when I click the submit button, then I should be redirected to the login page. Then we could add some additional acceptance criteria around those sad paths. So given I submitted a bad username, when I am redirected to the login page, then I should see an error message. So this is a little different than the one above it. I just kind of want to point out there's a difference here. Even though the trigger, or I should say the setup of the state is almost the same in terms of a bad username, the action that's occurring is different and the result is different. So the first the second acceptance criteria that we have here is given I submit a bad username, when I click the submit button, then I should be redirected to the login page. That's one acceptance criteria, but we have a different acceptance criteria that says given I submitted a bad username, same setup, but when I am redirected to the login page, that's a different trigger, then I should see an error message. And in fact, if you look very carefully at the second and the third acceptance criteria on here, you'll notice that the result of the first acceptance criteria, then I should be redirected to the login page, is actually the trigger for the next acceptance criteria, right? When I am redirected to the login page. So these two things are they're very, very closely tied together. But when I'm writing acceptance criteria, I'm very careful to do this, to make things very singular in terms of the whens and the thens. And if there are multiple results that should occur from one action, I want to write them out as separate acceptance criteria. And when you do that, that really helps with what I'm getting to on my next point here. And that is that these acceptance criteria, these separate individual acceptance criteria, could actually be rewritten as new stories. So I kind of mentioned this a little bit before, that an acceptance criteria could be rewritten as a new story. And just to kind of give you guys an example of this, if we take the acceptance criteria, given I submit a bad username, when I click the submit button, then I should be redirected to the login page. You could rewrite that as a user story that says, as Thomas, I want to be redirected to the login page after submitting a bad username so that I can try to log in again. Okay, so you can take that acceptance criteria and just kind of frame it back to the purpose and usefulness and value to that particular persona or user, right? That's all that you're doing, is you're taking that acceptance criteria and rewriting it as a story. Now, since you already have the acceptance criteria, you just have to move it over to that story. So instead of having this acceptance criteria be associated with the clicking of the submit button story, instead you can make it about being redirected to the login page, right? It's a different story that you can associate that same already written acceptance criteria. So this is kind of a nice little efficient way of doing this, is to, even though your story may be very broad, you can go through and think about all of the acceptance criteria, then write out all the different branched out stories, and then just simply move those acceptance criteria under those new stories you wrote. Okay, so it's just kind of a neat little efficient way. Whichever one that you kind of want to go through, I'm an advocate for all of them, okay? Whatever you feel is necessary, as long as you're finding ways of splitting those stories. Okay, so that was the second way. The second way that you can find the seams within your stories and acceptance criteria of where some other stories probably actually exist, so that you can break these big stories down into smaller ones. The third and final way is a little bit more in-depth, a little bit more complicated, but it's really not all that hard to identify. It just takes a little bit more thinking in order to do. So we're going to go back to, again, the use case steps. We've got the login use case. The user would first navigate to the home page, click on the login button, enter their credentials, click on the submit button, and then be redirected to the account page. So what would we possibly see? I see with a lot of developers that are trying to write acceptance criteria kind of falling back into the same habit that they originally got into a problem with when writing the story. And that is, they're trying to encompass too much in one thing. They're trying to be comprehensive about their acceptance criteria and include too many variables and factors in that acceptance criteria. So you might sometimes see acceptance criteria be written this way. So given I provide a username and password and I have not already made 3 attempts, if the username and password are valid, when I click the submit button, then I should be redirected to the account page. So I kind of want to talk real quickly about the setup of this particular acceptance criteria and how it sometimes gets to be created is because of all of the different factors in setting up the state. Remember, I talked about how given, when, then is really synonymous with arrange, act, assert. And the given or arrange is setting up the state of the system before you test it, right? Setting up all the different pieces in the state of the system ready to go before you activate the trigger that you're actually testing, right? So when we're thinking about it in terms of that, right? What are the arrangement? What are the different pieces of the system that I need to set up? It would make sense that somebody would write a given in this fashion. Given I provide a username and password and I have not already made 3 attempts, if the username and password are valid, right? It's like, here's the setup of all the different pieces of the system of the state that need to be set up first before the user clicks on the submit button. And that is kind of where you can get acceptance criteria that looks like this. But what should actually happen is that it should be broken out into new acceptance criteria. That each one of these uses of the word ands, ors, or ifs really is an indication that you have a different acceptance criteria that's necessary here. You need to write out you need to expand or create multiple instances of acceptance criteria where each one of the ands, you kind of break out into new acceptance criteria wherever you see an and or an or an if. Then ultimately, once you've broken it out into that separate acceptance criteria, you can then, again, use that new acceptance criteria to create stories around each one of those things. So you end up getting the exact same set of user stories, but all that you've done is you've taken this one big kind of, I wouldn't say incorrectly written acceptance criteria. You've just found a way, you found the seams within this really large and comprehensive acceptance criteria, and you found all the seams within it where you can create new acceptance criteria and therefore new stories. Okay, so that's what we're trying to do there. We're looking at the way that we're using language in the given, when, then to find those seams that are stated in terms of ands, ors, and ifs, and then you can draw out some new sort of acceptance criteria off of that, which then ultimately can result in new stories altogether. Okay, and this kind of goes back to the previous slide where we were talking about that, how we have separate, acceptance criteria. Okay, so those are the 3 different ways that you can handle finding the seams within the complexity of the user story to find ways of creating new user stories so that the scope of those stories is much smaller. And once you got those stories down into smaller scoped stories, they become easier to handle and no longer is complexity a problem of the story, right? So that one dimension of difficulty, that is complexity, is now eliminated because you've broken it out into several smaller stories. Okay, and you've done it based upon those different seams. Hopefully all of that makes sense to you. If you do have a question about any of that and you'd like some clarification, please feel free to drop me a comment in the comment section below this video and I will be happy to answer it. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is handling those unknowns. So we were talking about the different dimensions of difficulty, right? We were saying there's complexity, there's unknowns, and then there's communication, right? Those are the 3 different dimensions of difficulty. Now we're going to talk about the second dimension, which is the unknowns. How do you handle when there are unknowns about the story? So these are things, again, like, it's a new API I've never seen before. I need to go read the documentation, or I have to go create the client for this. I've never written a client, or it's a new framework or library that I've never touched before. Or you're asking me to learn something about, I don't know, data analysis or data analytics, and I don't know enough about those things to really be able to comprehend what it is you're looking for here. Whatever that unknown is that you need to go and explore and learn about, it is an unknown. It is something that you need to quantify in this story pointing. It's something that you need to articulate and say, there is something about this story that is going to prevent me from accomplishing it in a quick and timely manner, and it is something that I need to go explore. So how do you handle those unknowns? And again, this goes back to, if you have 2 or more dimensions of difficulty, then you shouldn't be doing the story. You should resolve one of those dimensions. So if you've decided that one of those dimensions on this story that was making the story difficult was that there is an unknown about it, this is what you can do about it. This is what you can do about handling that unknown. And quite simply, it's about planning a spike. Okay, this is the simplest solution to this, is to just simply plan a spike. Okay, so a spike is essentially something that is almost a substitute for the story as it currently sits, right? So you kind of put it in place of. Now, spikes are 0-point stories. And this is where I was talking about before, that user stories should not be 0-pointed, except when you are saying it is a spike. And I'm going to talk about that here in just a little bit. But essentially a spike, and I do want to be very clear about something here. It is my opinion that a spike should be 0 points. I am perfectly willing to accept that if you believe that spikes should also have a bare minimum value, I am okay with that. I am not going to push back too hard on this particular point, because it's not really particularly all that valuable or important. But I do think it makes a bit more sense to have spikes be 0 points, because there is no value to the user in doing them. There's value to the developer, but there's no inherent value to the user. And this just goes back to, and I'm going to go all the way back to the original Atlassian statement. Boy, this is way back here. All the way back to, boy, I'm going to have to, okay, this right here, right? This statement by Atlassian. The focus of story points is to be about shipping value, right? Shipping values, keeping the teams focused on shipping value. That is the purpose of story points. So if you are doing some sort of effort that does not deliver value to the user, it seems logical to me that it should not be a story point. That is where I think that it's okay to say it's 0. Okay, so that kind of goes back to this key point that I was making before about, there's no such thing as a 0-point story except for spikes, because spikes are not providing any direct inherent value to the user. There's no effort or work actually being done on something that is a direct benefit to the user. But again, I can be persuaded, and I'm going to have to switch all, I'm going to click all the way back. But I can definitely be persuaded. And if somebody wants to make an argument that, no, we need to have some sort of baseline value for that because there is an effort in doing a spike, I am perfectly acceptable and happy with doing that. But I would say that it kind of goes back to the, okay, what is that default value and how does it relate to the other values that you've decided in terms of effort, right? Do you reapply the rubric? Do you try to say this is a complex spike? Do you say that there are unknowns about this spike? Well, inherently a spike is about unknowns. So, I mean, it's going to be obvious. It's always going to be at least a 2 there, right? Or I'm sorry, at least a 4 in that case. So are you going to say that all spikes are 4 because there's a baseline value of 2? And then, because they're all, with any spike, there's always going to be unknowns? Or maybe you're saying that, no, we already know what it is that I need to learn. I just don't know how much of that, right? So I could be, again, persuaded any way that you want to go. I just think it's simpler, it's easier, it helps to, again, keep the story point focus on delivering value to the user through the efforts of difficulty, of trying to fix difficulty. I think it just is a little bit simpler if we say that story spikes are 0 points. But again, I'm just going to say this one more time. It doesn't really matter all that much to me. I can be persuaded to do something else with spikes and story points. Okay, so now a story spike should only be written if there is an unknown blocker. So the only time that you should really be planning a spike is when there is a user story out there that is being blocked because there is an unknown on it. Right? Because there is an unknown that is causing one of the dimensions of difficulty, and there's already another dimension of difficulty on it, right? There has to be 2 or more dimensions of difficulty. And if you've decided, well, one of the dimension of difficulty we need to resolve for this story is the unknown, then that means you can plan a spike for it. But if there's no user story, I kind of want to be, I want to be judicious about how I say this, because there are some organizations, I totally understand that like all of the work that they do is unknowns, right? All of the work is about exploring and finding ways and looking for things to do. Looking for ways to provide benefit to the company. Let's put it that way. Looking for ways to provide business value. In that case, you might have a team that's just strictly doing spikes. That's all that they do. Or maybe you plan spikes to help kind of do some of that exploration outside of the typical work that you do solving bugs or something. I totally get that may be the situation, but I would point back to the idea that if you have a spike planned, you should have some sort of purpose or reason or perceived value that you think this particular spike relates to. If you cannot articulate a value that this would provide to the user, why are you doing the effort? Okay. Now, again, this might be simply an architectural thing. I think this is probably a good example. I want to read more about architecture in terms of, maybe you want to, again, Mythical Man Month. Maybe this is the spike that you're going to do, is I'm going to go read about Mythical Man Month. I would say that you have to be very careful here, and this is where maybe the organization needs to make a decision, or the team needs to make a decision. Is that really okay for you to be on company time reading about things that are not providing any value to either the business or the user? If that's the case, that's probably not the right environment or time. Now, it may very well be. Maybe your organization says, hey, everybody gets an hour or 2 every day to go do this, or an hour or 2 every week to go do this kind of spiking exploration, but we're going to track it as a spike. That's entirely possible that it's done that way. But I want to be clear that if there really should be some association of this spike, this exploration of the unknown, it really should be pointing back to a story that does provide value to the user. So even though this effort of exploring does not provide any direct inherent value to the user, that doesn't mean it isn't associated to a value to the user. Okay? There's a little bit of a distinction, maybe distinction without a difference for some people, but I think it is an important thing to do, just at least to keep things categorized and simplified. So the original story. So what happens is when you plan a spike, essentially the original story that has the blocker, the unknown blocker, that story should get pushed back to the next iteration, so that during this iteration, that spike can be done, right? That exploration of the problem, that looking into a reading of the documentation for the API, or the testing out and building of a client to the API, or whatever that unknown is, can be explored freely in this iteration without the pressure of trying to get the spike and the story done in the iteration, right? And the story may be continuously moved back. Maybe the story, because it is 0 points, this is another good reason why I like spikes to be 0 pointed, is because they could be carried over. They are kind of an infinite, right? 0 is kind of an infinite number, which means it can be carried over to the next iteration if that spike hasn't been resolved yet. And if you move the spike over to the next iteration, that means that the original story also gets moved to the next iteration, right? The iteration after. So spikes really kind of replace the story in the current iteration, and then the original story gets moved to the next iteration, and that continues to happen until the spike has been completed, until the spike is resolved. Now, spikes are, as opposed to user stories, spikes are actually written for the developer. So this is kind of the opposite. This is when it is okay to write a story for the developer. So we would say something like, as a developer, I want to do this thing so that I can provide this value, right? So it's the same thing as a user story in terms of how it is written. It's who wants this, what is it they're going to do and why is it valuable? It still follows that same format, who, what, and why. But now, instead of the who being a user, it's not a user story, it's a spike, and a spike is for the developer. So as a developer, you could say as Steve or as Charlie or whoever the developer is on the team, as a developer, I want to do this thing, whichever the activity is that you're trying to explore, so that I can value. Now, here's the thing. The value is actually going to be pointing back to the original story, right? So you would say in a spike, as a developer, I want to, just for example, I want to research the Pokemon Go API so that I can complete the bag is full story. So the assumption here is you've got some sort of user story out there that is called the bag is full story. And you can't accomplish it because you've never worked with the Pokemon Go API before. So you need to go research the Pokemon Go API before you can complete the bag is full story. So what you're doing is you're writing a spike in the same format as a user story, but it's oriented towards a developer, but the value that's being provided by doing this spike points back to the original story that needs to be done. And this really is easily handled in systems like Jira or GitHub projects or something like that, where you can actually associate this spike back to the original story. So it makes it very easy to track, and it makes total sense because of course you're doing this spike to provide value for that other story, right? That's how you're kind of tracking the value and the reason and purpose behind doing this. And again, this is helping to articulate to whoever is reading this story the reason why you are doing the spike, okay? As a developer, I want to research the Pokemon Go API so that I can complete the bag is full story, right? So this, if I was just a manager, a product owner, or a project manager looking at this story, I understand why you are not currently writing any code. You're investigating, you're researching, you're looking into something so that you can do this other story that does need to be done. And that provides some context of why it is that you're doing the thing that you're doing. What is the effort that you are undergoing right now to resolve this unknown, and how it relates to another story, and that story is providing explicit value to the user or to the business, right? So that is what we're trying to do with a spike, is relay why the developer, something that is specifically about the developer in researching, and how it relates to another story, and that other story is providing direct value to the user, okay? So that's a spike. That is how you plan a spike. You kind of put together this very similar to a user story, but the user is actually a developer, and the value is always pointing back to the original story that caused the spike to be written, okay? All right. So the last dimension of difficulty. We talked about complexity, and we can resolve complexity by breaking stories down into smaller stories. And there's different seams that we can find within those stories to break them down. Then we talked about unknowns and handling those with spikes. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy solution. The last the last dimension of difficulty that can be associated with a story is communication, right? There's some sort of communication that needs to occur. And I wouldn't really necessarily call it issues. I know I put on the slide here handling communication issues, but it's not really always an issue. It may just be a part of how you resolve something or the work that you have to do. But putting communication in as a part of how you are determining the effort involved is something that goes back to, again, this little handy book. I'm really glad I had it on my desk. Mythical Man Month. There is a lot of work written in here by Frederick about how communication is a huge part of the work of doing software development, okay? And it's very rarely quantified. I've worked with many, many, many teams, and communication, how do you communicate the work being done or what needs to be done or cross-communicating between teams, that is something that is very rarely thought about when we're trying to write story points. It's just not even a part of it. The focus is typically on complexity, which is just, how difficult, or I shouldn't say difficult, but the complexity of the code, right? How complex is the code that I'm going to have to write, and how complex is the code that I'm going to have to work with. That's typically what people think about in terms of complexity, or maybe the architecture they have to work with. But that is only one piece of the bigger picture of how much effort a developer has to take in order to accomplish a story. And communication is one of those ridiculously overlooked pieces. Like, I don't know too many people that put communication in the forefront of their mind when they're trying to quantify effort. It's just kind of this given out there in the ether resistance to the work that's being done, instead of something that's actually quantified as part of the effort to do something. And I think that's a mistake. I don't think that there should just be this assumption that there's this negative pushback on all effort in terms of communication that we should just never really account for, but just assume that it exists. That's an incorrect approach. I think it's very easy to look at a user story and say there are going to be communication pieces. And typically these are going to come in two formats. There's actually a third that I don't really kind of want to get into, but I'm just going to focus on these two things. So there's external communication. That is, we're talking to somebody that is outside of the organization, right? It's a customer. It's maybe a non-direct user. Maybe it's a vendor. Maybe it's, a third-party API that we have to go talk to their customer service in order to get more information. Right? We could be using another API or another party's service, and we have to talk to them. So that is an external, outside of the business, outside of our organization, and we have to account for that communication, right? So it's definitely ideal. So how do you resolve these kind of communication issues when you're talking to those other people? Well, face-to-face is always better than phone. And phone is always better than email, right? But face-to-face is bar none the best way to go about it. So you kind of have to plan, instead of the story, you have to plan a meeting, right? That's really all that you're doing, is you kind of replace the idea of doing the story with some sort of meeting that has to be happening in this iteration, or maybe you won't be able to get to that meeting until the next iteration, but you cannot do the story until after the meeting takes place. And I think this is very similar to spiking a story, in that you should only plan on doing the story in the iteration after the one that has the meeting in it. Okay, I don't think you should be trying to put the communication, the meeting, and the story in the same iteration. I think that that's a mistake. You should be trying to replace your story with a meeting, and then once the meeting is done, then you can do the story in the next iteration. Now, if that seems too long, so if you're thinking, well, we're going to have the meeting on a Monday, and then our next iteration isn't going to be for another 3 weeks after that, or 2 weeks after that, well, that probably means your iterations are too big to begin with, and you should probably be thinking about narrowing your iterations to just 1 week. But that's a whole other topic. But really, you should be trying to essentially replace working on the story with a meeting. Now, I do want to reiterate and emphasize something here that I mentioned earlier, I've mentioned throughout this video, and that is, just because you have a communication does not mean that you don't work the story, nor does it automatically mean that you move the story back to the next iteration. But if there are 2 or more dimensions of difficulty, then you definitely have to move that story back to the next iteration until 1 or more of those dimensions are resolved. Okay, so if I have a story that has 2 dimensions of difficulty on it that I've identified, one of them is communication that needs to be had with the customer, then in that case, I would delay working the story until the next iteration and plan a meeting during this iteration, right? It's that simple. If I run into a user story that has no unknowns on it, it has 0 complexity to it, but I do need to communicate with somebody, I need to kind of get some information from that third-party vendor or something, but it's not really unknown, it's not really complex, like it's pretty well known, what it is that needs to be done. I know exactly what I need to ask for. And there's really, it's not a complex ask that I'm being asked for. It's a very narrowly scoped thing, but I do need to make that communication to some other party. Well, you could still have that story being worked in this current iteration, because as soon as you resolve that, you can pick up the story right then and there. And then it essentially becomes just the baseline effort, right? And you've resolved that, you've turned that story from a 4 into a 2 as soon as you have the meeting, right? So that's why it's okay to have a 4-point story in my rubric, a 4-point story. It's okay to have at least just one dimension of difficulty. But once you have 2, then that really kind of becomes problematic, and it makes it very difficult, because now let's take the idea that you have a user story that has unknowns and communication issues on it. Should you be trying to do that in this current iteration? Probably not, because that means you have a spike to plan to go learn through, and you have to set up a meeting with somebody. Are you going to be able to get all of that done and the work that's necessary done in this one iteration? Probably not, right? That's really not good planning. Could you put the spike in this iteration and move the story with still communication issues to the next iteration? Yeah, you could definitely do that, and just make sure you get the spike done before you actually try working on the story. That's what you have to do. It's a way of managing the challenges that are involved with the story. That's all that you're doing with this rubric of identifying the dimensions of difficulty. And then when you have a story that has a baseline value of something, and then you're allowed to have one dimension of difficulty, that just means all your stories are going to be really small. They're going to be easy to manage. They're going to be easy to work and identify. And then also you're going to be able to identify and look at all the challenges that are associated with them, and then be able to resolve each one of those things going through this process. Okay, so going back to having external communication that needs to occur for the story to be completed. Again, you want a face-to-face meeting. That is the best way to go about it. If you can't do that, I understand a phone, or even when I say face-to-face meeting, by the way, it can be, I am okay with video conference calls if you are familiar with them, right? If you and the other party do a lot of face-to-face communication, then it's perfectly fine to do that instead of in person, in my opinion. I think they're about equal. But if you can't do that and you only have phone, okay, that's fine, but it's better to have face-to-face. But really, email should be a last resort in this communication. It's just really, email's okay for asynchronous talk and kind of documenting things, but email is a really bad way of trying to work through a user story, right? Relying upon an email to be responded to so that you can continue working on a story, that is a very bad strategy. You should be avoiding that at all costs. So plan a meeting with the stakeholder, typically, preferably face-to-face. If not, maybe you can do it by phone. I do want to mention here domain-driven development or domain-driven design. It is domain-driven design is really the right term. What you're trying to do with domain-driven design is you want to map out the domain objects. So this is just helping. I just kind of want to talk about if you're dealing with a customer, right, and you're dealing with a what we call a domain expert. That's somebody that is in the industry that your product is for, and you're talking to them, you're working with them to try to figure out, okay, what are the different things, what are the different problems that they are trying to solve, and how your software helps to solve those things. You do this thing where you basically map out the domain objects, which are the different, you try to ascribe to the pieces of the software that you are writing. You're trying to associate them with things that are actually known by them. So you create these kind of software development objects, think about it in a software development object that represents an abstraction of the actual piece of work that they do. And you can have, state and behavior around those objects. I'm not going to get into domain-driven design here in any sort of depth or detail, but it is worth looking into if you're trying to figure out ways to better communicate with your external stakeholders. Your domain experts, the people that you're trying to work with, that are the customers you're trying to service. Understanding DDD and how to map out those domain objects, as well as creating some sort of ubiquitous language so that everybody that you are working with has some sort of common language that you're all using, really helps to fix some of those communication issues and create an understanding between what the customer wants and what you guys are going to deliver on your team. So those are just some strategies, some things to think about when you're having and planning those meetings. Is think about perhaps learning about domain-driven design, mapping out the domain objects, and creating a ubiquitous language for everybody to understand and have an agreement upon. One of the other things I really like to talk about is there's this Inception process where you define some goals, you define some non-goals, you identify some personas, and then we go through those steps of a use case, right? Those steps of a use case workflow. If you can get some clarity on those things, that's what you're really trying to get in those meetings, is the goals that they're trying to accomplish, the non-goals that they don't really care about, who are the types of people that this software is for or this user story is for. And then, if you don't know who that person is, like, for example, if your user stories keep coming to you in terms of a role, like as a user, as an anonymous person, as a clerical worker, as an administrator, if those are the personas that you are getting, you need to go back to the customer and say, who are we actually writing this for? It doesn't have to be specific names, but just give me an idea of the actual people that I'm writing this for, not just some person based upon their job title or their role within the organization. I want to know who are we writing this for? What are the characteristics of those people? And I like to break personas down into roles, goals, and potholes. I call them roles, goals, and potholes for personas. What are the roles that they have within the organization? What are the goals that particular person has in their interaction with the software? And potholes are, what are the things that we need to know about these type of people so that we avoid any sort of trouble when we're writing these things. Okay, so roles, goals, and potholes. Might do another video on that altogether about writing personas. But just know that these are the types of things you're trying to get clarity on when you're working with a stakeholder, with somebody that's external. And then also, on the flip side, if your external communication is to a third-party vendor, then you and that person's role kind of flip here. So you are trying to convey to them what your goals are. You're trying to convey to them what your non-goals are. You're trying to convey to them what your personas are. You're trying to convey to them what your use case workflows are, right? So the direction is just simply reversed. So you have clients that are trying to communicate to your system, but then if you're trying to talk to some sort of vendor, then you essentially are the customer, and you're still trying to get the same things. It's just that now you're on the other side of it, right? Okay, so that's if the communication that needs to occur for a story is happening with some sort of external person, right? Some sort of external organization or company or person that is not within your company, not within your business. You can't just go walk over to that person or get them on the phone. They're not a part of the organizational team that you're working with. And I don't just mean the team yourself, but I mean the actual entire business, the entire company. I should say that external could be an internal person, like if they are your customer, right? So if they are, I guess external would be more or less anybody who is outside of the development organization. So maybe it's somebody from accounting or somebody from sales. That's entirely possible. They're still kind of external to the software application, but they are essentially your customer, even though they are part of the organization. But you still follow the same rules, right? You still follow the same plan. But the next category that I want to talk about is inter-team. This is where I was mentioning before, what if you have some sort of requirement to go talk to or present specifications to another team to complete? So maybe your team is just working strictly on the front end piece, and then there's a back end team, or maybe there's a DBA team, or some sort of special handler of a different piece of the domain. Maybe you've got a microservice system in place at your organization, and a group that's handling another piece of the domain. and you need to kind of hand off some of the work, or you need to communicate with them, or you need to talk to them in order to find out information from them about how to integrate your piece with theirs. So that's the inter-team. Now, when this happens, when you have to have this kind of communication, you really should try to avoid asynchronous communication. Okay, this kind of non-real-time, this kind of back and forth things that we would do, and common systems that we find, like Slack, Microsoft Teams, using email, even a Kanban board or Jira, right? Sometimes that's how we try to communicate. Even though these are tools to help us plan our the order of work that we're doing, what sometimes can happen is that we would write up a ticket, say in Jira, and then we would add a comment, and then we would hope that that other person read the Jira ticket, right? And then they add their comments. That is not an effective way to have inter-team communication. Neither is email, neither is relying upon looking at each other's Kanban board or whatever, or burn down charts or whatever you're looking at. Like, that is not a good strategy in terms of trying to resolve stories. Now, don't get me wrong here. I'm being very explicit here that I'm talking about resolving user stories. That doesn't mean these are not good tools. It's just that they should have a completely different purpose, right? They should be purposed for other things that typically I like in terms of documentation or coordination of efforts, but or coordination of maybe what's in the backlog, but not in terms of I'm working a story and firing off an email to the other team and waiting for them to respond back. That is a very bad strategy. And Slack, even though it's a little bit more real time, same with Teams, that doesn't really make it any better because you don't know when you're going to hear back exactly. And then, of course, Jira tickets, again, just because you leave a comment on a Jira ticket and you ask somebody to comment back, that doesn't mean that there's going to be really good communication. And again, there is a place for asynchronous comms, but it is not in solving these stories. It's not about, you can have these tools, they're great for communication and inter-team cooperation, but when you're actually trying to solve a story and write the code or fix an issue or communicate about an issue, you don't want to be doing it via these asynchronous communications. You instead want to be doing something real time. You want to be working hand in hand with that person as much as possible, or with that team as much as possible. Maybe both of your teams will mob together. Like, that's entirely possible. Either you can pair program, you can swap people on teams, or you can ask that person to come over, or one of the experts over there, hey, can you spend an hour or two with me working on this problem? Or maybe you just mob everything. Maybe you bring both teams together to do a live session. Or maybe you do it in a Zoom communication room. Maybe you're using live share to kind of simultaneously work on the problem, very similar to pair programming, but you're doing it virtually. Like, you can do all of those things. But just make sure that the communication is more real time, not this asynchronous back and forth kind of, leapfroggy kind of way. You should be trying to simultaneously be looking at the same problem together at the same time, so that the context of the issue is known by both of you as you are discussing it and describing it and talking about the solution, and what this would entail. So that's basically my presentation. We've talked about what user stories are, story points are for, and how they are not a time quotient, and instead they should be about the difficulty, right? You're trying to quantify the difficulty or the effort around resolving these stories. They're not about time. They should never be about time. Then you have the dimensions of difficulty rubric, which allows you to identify and look at each story to determine the challenges of accomplishing that story, right? So it's a complex story, which is really the scope, right? The scope of the story is complexity. So if it's complex, we talked about looking at the story and identifying with each one of those stories, where are some seams within that story that we might be able to extract another story, a smaller piece of the puzzle so that the one story that we initially wrote isn't as big. It's not trying to tackle as much. Instead, we can break it out into a bunch of smaller stories. So we talked about the different strategies of identifying the seams within the story, within the workflow that generated those stories, within the acceptance criteria that's written for the story. Either there's multiple acceptance criteria, or maybe there's an acceptance criteria that was written with far too many ands, ors, and ifs, and kind of this branching logic here in the setup of the state of the acceptance criteria. We also talked about how acceptance criteria is really just another test. It's just another way of writing a test. That was pretty good. So we talked about all of those different strategies of resolving the complexity of the story. Then we moved on to the unknowns, right? And we're talking about how do you, if there's an unknown, something that needs to be explored about the story, what do? Well, you simply plan a spike. A spike should be a 0-point story. I prefer, again, I can have some pushback on that. That's perfectly fine. But you have these spikes that are really software developer stories. They're for the developer, and they point back to the value of doing that spike is pointing back to some other story. You really shouldn't be doing a spike unless you have a story that has an unknown that requires the spike, okay? Otherwise, you're not really doing it for anything other than just your own edification and learning, which I'm not against. I'm certainly not against. All I'm saying is that probably should not be tracked in the system, because we're tracking story points in order to determine the effort and track the work being done for producing some sort of value to the customer. And if it's a spike that is just for your own self-edification and has nothing to do with any effort that's undergoing for the customer, then it probably doesn't need to be tracked. It doesn't need to be something that's in the system. And also, there's no such thing as a 0-point story other than a spike, because a 0-point story means, why are you even doing it? If there's no effort or there's no difficulty to the problem, then anybody can do it. It really shouldn't be on the developers to do that thing. It should be on somebody else. It really should. So we talked about spiking, so that and the spike goes in place of the story. The story gets shuffled to the next iteration so that the spike can be done during this iteration. And then finally, we talked about communication, right? And dealing with anybody outside of our team, whether that is the customer or a vendor, but somebody that is interacting with our system outside of the boundary of our application. And that could be somebody completely external to the company, to the organization. But also we have this inter-team, right? So if we're dealing with external people outside of the organization, we want to try to plan face-to-face meetings, and we kind of put those meetings on the docket instead of the stories. So we move, similar to spikes, we move the stories to the next iteration, and we plan a meeting during this iteration. And when you're doing those communications with those external parties, you're trying to get clarity on the goals, the non-goals, the personas, and the steps that are involved in the use case workflow. Again, if you are taking these requirements from the customer, then you're trying to plot out these goals, non-goals, personas, and use case steps. But if you are working with a third-party API, you are expressing to them, you're trying to convey to them those same things. What are your goals? What are your non-goals? What are your personas? And what are your use case steps? So that's what you're trying to do, okay? You're trying to convey that information back and forth between those external parties. If you are dealing with an internal, if you're dealing with a team that is internal to the organization that you need to work with, try your mightiest to avoid asynchronous communications, right? We're trying to avoid email. We're trying to avoid Jira or Kanban or Slack or any of those communication systems that do not work in real time in tandem with that person or with that team. Again, that doesn't mean you never use those tools. It just means that those tools are not meant for solving your user stories, right? They shouldn't be used for the work directly related to the story that you're trying to resolve. Instead, you should be trying to do as much as you can, try to do real-time communication. I realize that this is not always possible, okay? So don't get me wrong. I understand that sometimes that person is only available via email. Like I've tried multiple times, but they only respond to their email, and they don't even respond to their Slack. They don't respond to Jira. Like they don't they won't work with me. They say they don't have time to come work with us. I get that. That happens. But as much as you possibly can, try to avoid those situations and make it the norm that your team will actively bring those people in to work with you through the solution. Okay? That needs to be a matter of course. Like, that is the way that you guys do your business. That is the way you conduct yourselves as professionals. You bring those people in to work with you on those problems. You don't just rely upon that asynchronous communication of Slack and email, because it may be easier in some cases. It may seem simpler, but it means that there's going to be a longer delay in getting the stuff done, and also context can be lost, right? We don't understand things, and it can lead to a long chain of emails, a long chain of Slack messages back and forth about this, that, or the other thing. That doesn't, it's external communication that's not necessary, where if you just worked together and looked at the problem together at the same time, the solution would snap right into place and you guys could go moving on about your day. So that's basically it. I hope you guys enjoyed this. This is this is very similar to how I do TDD, my TDD lesson for React. This is an actual lecture that I would produce in the classroom. This is so hopefully if you guys are working for organizations that you're looking to build better agile systems, you're trying to build your teams up, feel free to reach out to me, because I can get you in contact with Galvanize, the company that I work for. We do this for a variety of different companies and large enterprise organizations. So this is something that I do all the time. That's the same kind of content that I deliver. And if you're looking for really good, useful help and coaching and learning in the classroom, if you want agile education, extreme programming education, Scrum education, we can do all of those things. But we also, of course, train on some of the basics, like, if you have a team that wants to learn about .NET or about Java or Spring Cloud or microservices or Kubernetes or Docker or AWS or Azure, like you name it, you name what it is that your organization is looking to learn about, and we have a program that we can either we already have an existing program for it, or we can easily create the curriculum for it. We have a very large staff of professional individuals that can definitely put together the curriculum and do the delivery. So if you're looking for any sort of help within your organization on any of these things, please feel free to reach out to me, and I will make sure that you get in contact with the right person, so you can have quality content just like this delivered in the classroom, in person, with the teams, coaching them, working through all of these problems, and kind of continuously correcting them. That's what I do on a daily basis. That's my job, and I absolutely love it. I hope you guys get that. I love talking about this stuff. I know there are a lot of slides in this particular one, but because we're dealing with a lot of abstract concepts. But I think that I've given you guys hopefully enough really good, useful, helpful information and strategies to tackle the dimensions of difficulty and understanding that rubric, right? Knowing what the dimensions of difficulty are and how you can, what are the strategies you can use in order to fix each one of those things. I especially think that the big one is handling complexity, right? How do you rewrite stories? How do you find the seams within the stories to make smaller stories and be better apt at quantifying the effort and work that the teams are doing? Anyway, if you guys did like this video, please hit the thumbs up button and make sure you like it and favorite, subscribe it, all that good stuff. I appreciate it when you guys do. It's a big help when you guys do all that stuff. So I appreciate the engagement. Again, if you guys have any questions on any of this, please feel free to drop me a comment in the comment section below. And if you are interested in any of those kind of services, like I talk about that we deliver for Galvanize, feel free to reach out to me and I will make sure you get in contact with the right person. So thank you so much, everybody. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.